Okay, guys, we'll get going. The attendance code is on screen if you want to check in. I'm sorry I'm late. My dog decided to be sick just before I was about to leave. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about governance and ownership of football in the UK. So in terms of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to look at the key stages of commercialisation. So how did we get from kind of clubs that were started within their communities to these kind of global brands that we see today? What were the stages within that commercialisation of the game? Tied to this, what have been some of the kind of failings of football governance? And we're going to look at this particularly in Scotland. We're going to consider the position of football governance in the UK, including the recent European Super League scandal, if we want to call it that. And we're going to have a look at what can be done to improve governance. So what work has been done and what are the recommendations out there to improve governance of football within the UK. And there's a recommended screening. I don't think we'll get time to watch it. But if we do, we'll start it. But it's on Canvas if you want to watch it. So if we're thinking about the commercialisation of football, this is probably quite a nice quote. This was as early as 1974, really talking about the shift that we have within society, whereby we've got more free time, we've got more time for leisure and activities, therefore more people are spending time watching football. So the filing of the time away from the job also becomes dependent on the market, which develops to an enormous degree those passive amusements, entertainments and spectacles that suit the restricted circumstances of the city and are offered as substitutes for life itself. So what role does sport kind of play within this leisure activity? We've got more disposable income, people are working less, people aren't working as often on a Saturday, so there's this kind of void that needs to be filled, and sport is kind of a great substitute to do it. And actually, if we think about the commercialisation of football, it goes back quite a long way. It's not a kind of a recent phenomena within football. A couple of examples here. We've got Bovril sponsoring the English Cup and cigarettes there on the right, sponsoring so Ollie Elise, this kind of poster for cigarettes tying into football. If we have a look here, this is Villa Park in Birmingham, and you might be able to see that the stands, the advertising, and actually the main sponsorship is Bovril. So as early as 1932, the kind of impact that commercialisation is having within football. So from the early days of codification of the game, so the kind of set up the establishment of the rules of football, football's always provided opportunities for people to make money, and companies and individuals used every opportunity to extract money from the paying customer, principally the fans who attend the matches. So even if you think about going to a game today in 2023, how many times are you tried to sold, are people trying to sell you or upsell you in certain things? So, okay, yeah, you've bought the ticket, but you go past the club shop, you walk past the merchandise stand, all the other bits and pieces that you're sold to. That's not to mention all the advertising boardings that are trying to get you to purchase something throughout that kind of course of that 90 minutes. It's not just the ticket itself that you're paying for. So crowds were the biggest immediately after the Second World War as people sought entertainment and a select few footballers began to assume some celebrity status. And England's World Cup win in 1966 showed early potential for the commercialisation of the game. Television kind of created the audience, and then sponsorship up to the commercial stakes. So we have this coincidement with the development of media, the opportunities to advertise or show football, increased opportunities to sell advertising boards, and so you've got that hoarding around the pitch. Is kind of the value of those goes up because the game's going to be seen by more people. So huge opportunities to kind of get your brand out there. This is Stanley Matthews promoting cigarettes, the cigarette for me. So Stanley Matthews was kind of one of those early football stars. and was obviously kind of highly sought after brands to try and promote their goods and products, cigarettes being a big one at the time. So it was the 1966 World Cup in England that was kind of a big catalyst for this development of commercialization within the game. So their triumph, which helped both glamorize football and acts as a marker in the growing commercialization of the game. So although at the time there was only black and white, it was only sort of shown in black and white. The first World Cup shown in colour was 1970. An estimated 400 million were watching around the world. And kickoff times were adjusted to suit television. So you see that nowadays where you have a kickoff at 12:30, perhaps one at 5:30. You might even have one at 8 o'clock. But then that's just the Premier League. There's all these kind of games around the world which are trying to be suited for an international audience, not just those that are actually physically going to the game. And this was happening as early as the 1960s. And the English FA produced the first World Cup mascot, and there was early merchandising. So the famous football series by Texaco. But at that point, the BBC was still able to insist there was no pitch-side advertising. So following the World Cup, we kind of have this development of the idea of a concept, the club brand, and really one of the first club brands were Manchester United. They were kind of, and still are, huge in this kind of area of commercialization of the game. And actually, it kind of came from a bit of a tragedy. The Munich air disaster in 1958 made the club kind of famous around the world. But this development association was formed following that as a way to kind of raise funds for the development of the club. And they started to think of other ways in which they could generate more income. They became more well-known. They had the first private boxes at Old Trafford in 1964, opening a souvenir shop in 1967, installation of billboards around the stadium in 1975, entered into a contract with Sharp, who they had for a long time into the 90s, and the entrance onto the stock market as well. So they were looking at all these ways in which they could generate additional income. And you think about the club now, it's kind of a worldwide known brand. Probably one of the things best known about England if you go abroad. There's also opportunities for kind of sponsorship of competitions as well. So we've got the Watney Cup here on the left and the Texaco Cup on the right. And we've also got the transformation of FIFA as well, which will obviously be very relevant to perhaps some of the essays you're thinking about writing or some of those conversations you're thinking about writing in terms of international sports federations. It was really from the 1970s that we start to see FIFA become a very commercially operated organization. Obviously, if you think of FIFA now, you think of the kind of money that they derive from broadcasting rights, selling the rights for the World Cup, all the kind of merchandise that goes along with a World Cup. But it wasn't really until the 1970s that they started to think about how they could generate more income. And you have João Havelange, who won the election to become president in 74. And he had this real concept of how he was going to develop FIFA and start to bring in more money into the organization. So huge expansion of sports marketing was required to finance his plans for the development of the World Cup. And by 1975, FIFA had agreed its first global deal with Coca-Cola. And if you think about now, FIFA's modern day tiered and packaged sponsorship model has provided a template for English football and all other football and its commodification. So what we're thinking about there, does anyone know what we're talking about when we're talking about this kind of multi-tiered package sponsorship deal? No. So we've got... Yeah, go on.
So basically, whatever person wins, every other level get some, no matter where they actually end up. So I guarantee to earn something, right?
Yeah. So just your participation in the competition alone is going to generate you some income. So we've got that aspect. We've also got this kind of sponsorship package deal as well, where you'll have your principal primary partners. If you think about the English Premier League, there'll be the likes of Coca-Cola and Cadbury's, and then you'll perhaps have smaller partners for different aspects as well. So it's kind of modern tiered package model in which certain brands will get certain benefits. I wouldn't say I would recommend watching this, but has anyone seen the film that FIFA financed about themselves? I can't even remember what it was called, but it was kind of done after around the 2015 corruption scandals came out about Sepp Blatter. It was kind of this self-financed film about the history of FIFA and a very kind of one-dimensional look at how they became this kind of global brand. in which Sepp Blatter comes out of it surprisingly well and was never involved in any corruption. But kind of quite an interesting look to see about how he was quite critical to this kind of formation of these partnerships with sponsors. So Coca-Cola and Adidas. He was, well, certainly the film portrays him as being very critical to the development of these partnerships. So again, not sure if I'd recommend watching it, but interesting nevertheless. There's also kind of this uneasy relationship. I think we could include betting here as well, just included alcohol. So they became, alcohol was kind of a big sponsor of football from the sort of 70s to, well, 2000s really. So we have Nottingham Forest here. Anyone know who that individual is? Go on. Roy Keane, yeah. We've got Carlsberg here. I think that's Stephen Gerrard, but can't really see enough of his face. We've got Norwich City being sponsored by Foster's and Manfield Beers as well. I think that's Hull City. And what's I think is kind of important to think about here is that the kind of during the 80s there was a big issue within football in terms of hooliganism, and there was a lot of stadium disruption and fan disorder, and there was a few disasters involved as well, not entirely created by fan disorder, of course. Well, we've got the Bradford fire, Heysel accident, and the Hillsborough disaster as well. So 3 incidents in which reports came out that said football needs to fundamentally change the way it's run. We can't keep having incidents in which fans go to stadiums and aren't safe. So we've got this violence, terrible state of football. There was this kind of Justice Taylor report that comes out that says clubs need to develop their stadium, basically. They need to develop their facilities. So when people come to games, they're safe. And the stadiums are fit and proper appropriately. Problem with that, of course, is that requires a huge sum of money. So there's this kind of real need to rethink the way football is run within the UK, and there's this kind of concept of an elite competition in which perhaps the previously financial distribution was a lot more balanced across the leagues, but the bigger clubs decided that actually they wanted a bigger chunk of it. Created the Premier League, and you can see the teams that were there at the start of it. No West Ham, which is a shame, but never mind. Anybody you recognise on the screen there? What about this young man down here? Any Scotland fans? No, we've got Gordon Strachan here. Vinnie Jones, if anyone remembers him playing football before he was in films. Peter Beardsley as well. So the kind of start of the Premier League in 1992 was kind of really critical in terms of generating this income. And they sold the rights to Sky Sports. So we've got the launch with broadcast deal with B-Sky B, which was owned by Rupert Murdoch. Obviously, before you couldn't really watch football in the same way. So Sky used sport essentially to try and get their dishes out to people. They knew people would pay for sport. So it was kind of this partnership with B-Sky B. And then we didn't have any English Premier League games shown on terrestrial TV, so BBC or etc., until the coronavirus pandemic a couple of years ago. Some people might remember games being shown on BBC as a way to there were so many games happening that they kind of shared them around to give them a bit of extra cash as well. So the Premier League now sells its own broadcasting rights both in the UK and across the rest of the world. The previous broadcasting arrangements meant money was shared between the Football League clubs. So now the English Premier League clubs are getting a bigger chunk of the money, which kind of creates this disparity between the rest of the leagues. The English Premier League, private company, wholly owned by its member clubs. So each club gets one vote. Obviously, if you get relegated, you lose your vote. Kickoffs reflect broadcasting interests and include Sunday and Mondays, which was very different from what it used to be. Obviously, 3:00 on a Saturday was the kind of staple for football. And then we've now got this kind of suite of sponsors opposed to a title sponsor. So we've got the different partnerships that I mentioned there, Cadbury's, Coca-Cola, Panini, kind of all of these sponsors, and then kind of a tiered system as well. And it's really established to maximize financial exploitation of club businesses. So all of these clubs are really trying to generate as much income as they can. And there's less concern really for the welfare of the game as a whole. So there's less money going into the rest of the Football League. Is really trying to generate as much money between, I wouldn't even say between the top 20 clubs, but really, if you think about it, it's between the top 6 in terms of who can qualify for European competitions as well. So we've got a little diagram here from Chelsea, which shows, just the way that their thinking is in terms of their global fan base. Of course, previously it would have been a segment of London. Now they're looking at, if you're watching Chelsea from around the world, what time will the games be kicking off? So they've got this kind of global audience in mind. They're trying to appeal to this kind of audience around the world, not just in West London. And actually, if you watch football now, we've got brands sort of synonymous with the sport. You can't really watch a game for 90 minutes and not sort of pick out a brand that you've seen, whether that be a kind of a betting or a casino on the kind of front of shirt sponsorship. This is Monster Energy sponsoring Tottenham, or advertising with Tottenham, sorry. We've got Coca-Cola, of course, and then bookmakers as well are pretty ubiquitous throughout the kind of 90 minutes as well. And if we go back to Manchester United now, in 2023, they've got 27 sponsors brands on their website. This includes an official global mattress and pillow supplier, and an official betting partner, which is Betfred. They've got regional partners, which include Harv's Indoor Entertainment Center partner for the People's Republic of China. They claim they've got a more significant presence on Chinese social media, with 9.4 million followers on the kind of Chinese equivalent of Twitter. And their website states that they have a global community of 1.1 billion fans and followers. So almost 1/8 of the world's population apparently are a Manchester United fan. Not quite sure how they've calculated that, but kind of interesting to know the kind of support that they feel that they've got around the world. And then their total income, if we compare it to the start of the Premier League in 1992, it was 20.1 million. If we compare it to kind of as recently as a couple of years ago, it was 590 million. So this kind of 2,800% increase in revenue. So just to look at the kind of commercialization in the last 20 odd years, absolutely huge. We've got the kind of rules that are coming into play as well, which are actually creating a kind of more unbalanced playing field, arguably. So we've got the Bosman ruling. Anybody aware of the Bosman ruling? No. That's good though. We'll come to that later on. Anyone aware of Jean Bosman? All right, Belgian footballer. He came to the end of his contract. The club he was playing for essentially wanted to keep him on, but they didn't want to keep him on at the same salary. So they wanted to extend his contract for less money. And he basically at that time didn't have much of a say as to that. If the club wanted to extend it, he had no choice. He had to go along with it. So he took them to the Court of Arbitration for Sport and basically said he should be allowed to negotiate a new contract at the end of his existing one or negotiate with another club when it expired. So we now have this ruling where you have players that are coming towards the end of their contracts free to go and explore with other clubs once they've expired and negotiate new deals. That wasn't really in place before. Why might that kind of create a imbalance within the game? It's great for the individual. Why might that kind of create an imbalance to some extent? Yeah, exactly. So if you've got a player that you know is running towards the end of their contract and you want to keep them on, the player might refuse to extend a new contract because they know that they could move to a Manchester City or someone like that. So you've now got a position where clubs are trying to tie players into longer contracts so that if they do sell them, they're going for quite significant amounts of money. We've got kind of free market as well. So other kind of aspects that apply only to football. So the FA removed the restriction on dividends and on directors working part-time from its rule book. So that meant that clubs could now try and be as profitable as they wanted to be, pay out more dividends to shareholders, whereas previously there was a restriction on that. Also trying to unregulate, I suppose, the amount of work that directors put in and how they're remunerated for that. We've then got UEFA trying to establish its club's licensing and financial fair play regulations. The Premier League topping the Icon League table, asserting that the league is one of the most popular sporting competitions with matches broad to 800 million homes in 188 countries. And then earlier this year as well, we've had Manchester City being charged with breaching its rules on more than 100 occasions over multiple years in relation to financial fair play as well. And actually, you could kind of look at the treble win by Manchester City earlier this year as kind of a symbolic point in terms of the commercialization of the game. We've got this quote here: "A game that followed the money and left the fans behind." So the fact that Manchester City, obviously owned by Abu Dhabi investment group. So it's a kind of question, I guess, is the Premier League triumph for commercialism? Largely unregulated marketplace, a few mega rich clubs and owners, triumph for sport without any morality, arguably. Gambling brands are pretty prolific, and clubs being taken over by states with human rights records, which we'll come to. Meanwhile, we've got a situation in which the future of some clubs lower down the Football League is very, very bleak. Some of them are going into administration or can't find the money to pay players. And actually a triumph for those, such as the Premier League itself, who argue that government has no role to play in sport. So we'll look at this a bit later on. So whether or not this is a question for capitalism is kind of a question. It's not very regulated. There's huge financial disparity. So what does that kind of say about the state and the society we live in? So if we think about that as being the commercialization or the story of commercialization to an extent, we can think about football governance as well with this context in mind. So football is among the least regulated and has largely been left to look after itself. Generally accepted that unregulated markets have a tendency to harm themselves or end up unequal. What other examples can we think of recently that we've kind of... what other sectors of society need regulating, do we think? Or have regulators, in fact? Housing, yep, good. And we could argue about the effectiveness of some of these regulators, but yep, housing. Sorry? Say again. Gambling, okay, yeah, there is regulation around gambling, yeah. We've also got media. The media are regulated to some extent. If you have a complaint to make, you can make it to Ofcom. Yeah. The energy market is supposedly regulated as well. So we've got these things that are tried to be regulated. Whether or not regulation in that sense is hugely effective, it can be discussed. But football has largely been left unregulated, so there's no one involved in kind of how it's directed or what rules are involved. It's very much left to football themselves to date to do that. And the reason that football remains unregulated, whereas other sports perhaps aren't, are because football is self-financing. Football generates its money from broadcasting, which is very different from the kind of sports we looked at last week in the lecture. So those kind of sports governing bodies, hockey, for example, basketball, netball, they don't have huge broadcasting deals, right? So they're very reliant upon government funding. And with government funding comes certain strings attached in terms of what they expect you to do in terms of regulation. So you've got football that kind of doesn't need to rely upon government support. It's a very commercial, capitalist system, whereas you've got these other sports that are reliant upon Sport Scotland funding or UK sport funding that have to adhere to those kind of rules and regulations that we looked at last week. We've got football clubs who originated as members. By the end of the Second World War, the influence of key businessmen resulted in a shift of ownership and led to the benefactor model. So they had kind of wealthy people from local communities that had done well, made their money, wanted to buy their football club, and were happy to put money into the club without it necessarily making a profit for them. But actually a key danger of this is that clubs were being run unsustainably. And then the problem with that is what happens if that person then doesn't want to run that football club anymore. You have huge debts, you perhaps don't have someone to buy the club's unsustainable. And we can look at this in Scotland. So this is from about 10 years ago, but PricewaterhouseCoopers review of Scottish the SPFL stated that 10 clubs made a combined loss of £11 million. So kind of huge losses in the Premiership. And considering there have been 154 instances of British football clubs being placed into administration or have been liquidated since the year 2000, there is now little doubt that there exists a recognition that no one type of ownership model is right. And actually in certain markets, football clubs are unlikely to make a profit unless they change the way that they are run. So we kind of looked at some of those changes in ownership, but European football in particular has experienced a huge increase in foreign ownership since the start of the 21st century, particularly from the United States. If you look at the clubs in England, quite a lot of influence now coming from the United States in the form of Chelsea and Arsenal, for example, Manchester United, of course. You've got Russia and the Middle East as well that have had involvement, less so from Russia, but certainly the Middle East. Now there's just five clubs, in the English Premier League that are not in the hands of foreign investors. And these foreign owners may not have the same motivation as domestic owners. So they don't perhaps come from those communities originally and want to see the club do particularly well in a sporting sense, but they perhaps have some sort of alternative motivation to owning those clubs. In particular, American owners usually identified as profit maximizers. So they're perhaps not interested in the sporting success. They want to try and generate as much wealth as they can in owning it. And Manchester United are probably quite a good example of this in terms of how the Glazers run the club. And the dividends that they pay out to their directors are pretty astounding, really, considering the kind of loss that the club makes. So we've had Arsenal, Burnley, Liverpool, Manchester United, all in American hands. Aston Villa, largely owned by American owners. Got Chelsea as well. You can add into that mix more recently. So this kind of more Americanized model of ownership with a greater emphasis on profit maximization. And it could be argued that being motivated by financial gain is in opposition to this kind of more traditional sense that we have about European football clubs, which are interested in success upon the pitch rather than profit. What are the other kind of key differences between the American sporting models and the UK sporting models in terms of leagues and how they're run? Okay, so they've got a draft system. Yep. Yep. Yeah.
This season, we still draft first our team, but they're really watching. I think that's what it is. Liz Morton from MAI, the New York Red Bulls, top three.
Yeah.
Because of the draft system, what's their favour.
Yep. Okay, so draft system. Yep. Kind of key difference in terms of how American sport and UK sport are run.
It's franchising.
Franchising models, which aren't the same in the UK. Yeah. What else? Kind of a big one. How does the NFL work in comparison to the Premier League at the end of the season? Sorry? Yeah, okay. So for the title, for the Super Bowl, yeah, okay. So they've got that kind of, competition at the end. I'm thinking more about the other end of the table. No relegation, right? So American model, not just in American football, but baseball as well. There's no relegation. Why is that a safe model to buy a sports club? Yeah. Sorry, what are you going to say? Safety net. Yeah, exactly. So you can buy a club in America and know that your investment's relatively safe, because even if you come bottom, you're not going to get relegated. You're still going to share in this kind of, and arguably the American system is a lot more socialist in lots of ways in terms of profit distribution and revenue distribution across the league. And also, you mentioned the draft system there. If you come bottom, what happens if you come bottom next season? You get to pick the best, the first pick of the draft, right? So there's a kind of opportunities there for you to strengthen your squad or your roster. So very different kind of setup between the UK and European models, where Europe you're kind of on your own. There's no kind of safety net. If you get relegated, you're going to drop down. You're going to lose out on revenue. So this kind of shift between the Americanization of the Premier League, these American owners coming in trying to maximize profits. There is a bit of a concern that if a majority of the clubs in the Premier League were owned by American owners, they could change the rules and they could prevent relegation. So the Premier League could just become a kind of closed league system in which clubs can't be relegated, which would increase interest in buying those clubs because their investment is relatively safe. So kind of three really interesting changes in ownership over the last, since the Premier League started. We've got Roman Abramovich here on the left, purchasing Chelsea in 2003. They were losing £100,000 a day in kind of finances, at least as a minimum. Millions of pounds a week they were running the club at as a loss, because he was so wealthy he had no interest in running it for kind of financial return. And then we've got the City Group, the Abu Dhabi City Group, that have purchased Manchester City in 2008, I want to say. Obviously there with Pep Guardiola and the treble they recently won. And then on the right here, a couple of years ago, we had the Saudi Arabia Investment Fund, so almost a state going out and purchasing a football club, essentially, although they would argue it's not. But this kind of argument of sports washing. What's their interest in buying Newcastle United? What are their alternative motives here? It's not about profit maximization. What's it about for them? Do we think? Why might a nation be interested in buying a football club? What does a football club bring them? Tourism. Yep, good.
Using sports to
yeah, okay, good. So using sport to change a perception or a reputation of a country. Yeah, so certainly Newcastle United fans might feel very differently about Saudi Arabia now than they did 18 months ago, right? So this kind of use of football, which is really popular, gives exposure, creates kind of narratives and discussion points, using Newcastle United almost as that vehicle to change the narrative about the country. Perhaps the kind of biggest example of this Americanization or this sort of shift in the ownership of clubs in England is the European Super League. So a couple of years ago, in 2021, announced that 12 of Europe's leading professional clubs had formally agreed to create this European Super League. It was going to be an annual tournament, one which included 20 clubs in total, made up of 15 permanent or founding clubs, and a further 5 clubs who would qualify for participation based on their success in their kind of respective domestic leagues. And the motivations behind this can be classified within 4 categories. So we've got obviously the opportunity for them to make financial profit and gain. We've got the financial security aspect. We've got familiarity with the closed league model. And we've got the kind of decline of competitive balance in European men's football. So given what we said, how would the European Super League have been of interest to perhaps to that Americanization? Why was that kind of a dream set up for them? Why were they so keen to see it happen?
The thing that where a lot of them were losing money, talking around it, and they haven't off a lot. So they need the money to find yes, especially with the English market actually going. They need to be they're playing with Britain, the fact that they're the ones to get that the last of the release anyway.
Yep. So we had who were the 3 main drivers of it?
Juventus, Barcelona and Real Madrid.
Yeah, exactly. So there was a concern there from those clubs that perhaps the English Premier League was becoming a bit too powerful. So they wanted to try and create a system in which they could generate money from this annual tournament that kind of suited their needs. For the English clubs, what was in it for them? Why were they so keen to participate? Who were the English clubs that signed up to it? Tottenham were there, yeah. 2 others? Yep. Excellent. So we've got these kind of 6, the big 6. I'm not sure how Tottenham sneak in there, but we've got the big 6. Not that I'm a bit of a West Ham fan or anything, but we've got the big 6 that want to set up this league. And for them, there's this kind of real desire to maintain this kind of closed league system. So they are always going to qualify for it. Every year they're going to be in this competition regardless of how well they've done in the league, which if you look at last year in the Premier League, Tottenham wouldn't have been there, Chelsea wouldn't have been there, Liverpool would have maybe scraped in. So, these teams can have bad seasons, but still qualify for this competition, benefit from this revenue. And that kind of spits in the face of what we would traditionally think of being as a fair competition, where you have to earn your right to participate and to get the benefits from it. Kind of quite in line with this Americanization of sport, but English clubs withdrew from the European Super League, which really stemmed from public pressure to do so, and was generated by the negative reaction of the football community towards the attempt. And there's a kind of a key point that traditionally imagined by fans as belonging to communities rather than individual owners, despite the fact that actually they are owned technically, legally by these kind of wealthy individuals. Fans still see them as being owned by their communities. So this kind of stemmed and created this need to review the way that football governance was going. The fallout from it was so huge that the kind of government thought there needed to be greater involvement of supporters within the decision making of football governance. So they initiated this fan-led review by Tracy Crouch MP, and there was a kind of a list of recommendations. So there was the recommendation that there was the creation of this new regulator for English football who would oversee financial regulation in football. So we went back to this idea of football's always regulated itself. Now the government is saying, actually, we don't really trust you to regulate yourself anymore. And we believe there should be an independent person that oversees how clubs are running, which has not been very popular with clubs, as you can imagine. We've got a new owners and directors test for clubs. And this is to test whether or not somebody should be allowed to buy a football club, who should be allowed to be a director of a club, how should they be allowed to be involved in that decision-making process, who are the people that should be allowed to do this. Football needs a new approach to corporate governance to support a long-term sustainable future of the game. So we can't have a situation whereby clubs are just racking up millions of pounds of debt and being run unsustainably, because ultimately the people that suffer are the fans. And we've got this kind of uniquely important stakeholder. Supporters should be properly consulted by their clubs and taking key decisions by means of a shadow board. And this kind of last one is a recognition of that, so that football clubs are a vital part of their communities. They've come from communities. And in recognition of this, there should be additional protection for key items of club heritage. So basically, before a club decides it wants to change its name, its colours, its crest, its stadium, fans should be properly consulted on these decisions, which is obviously not something clubs have ever had to do. They might want to do it, but never had to do it. So this is kind of a recommendation that clubs will have to do it. And in Scotland, we've had something similar as well. The Green Party put forward something a number of years ago that basically said supporters should have the right to buy their football clubs if they go up for sale. And as part of the kind of Community Empowerment Act, football was considered within this. And they did a review of the way that football clubs were run in Scotland. One of the recommendations was that there should be kind of a business, community and enterprise unit established to support clubs that perhaps wanted to transition to more community-focused ownership. Clubs had to declare to the SPFL, to the league and the FA, that they published the identity of the ultimate beneficiaries of clubs, something they never had to do. I'm not sure if that surprises people or not. Clubs should provide information annually on the number of board meetings held, on the number of directors attending. They have to develop this kind of liaison point within clubs that need to be a direct point of contact for fans, and that a support involvement ward is created to celebrate clubs further involving fans. Very few of these things have actually happened since the report came out. I don't know if people will be surprised by that either, but that was some of the recommendations that actually happened. I think you mentioned the 50+1 rule. So we have a system or an opportunity essentially where we could have 50% plus one, so a minimum of 50% of a club being owned by a democratic body in which fans could own this democratic body, and they would have ultimately the ownership rights to a football club to protect that club for the interest of its fans and community. And that would be to ensure that clubs are democratic and the membership of the entity works on a kind of a one member, one vote basis rather than a wealthy individual buying all the shares and being able to kind of change the direction of the club. To try and create clubs that are inclusive and there are no substantial barriers to participation, that profits are reinvested back into the club as opposed to being distributed to shareholders. So fan-owned clubs try and put their non-profit organizations, as we spoke about last week, they put their profits back into the club to develop their activities rather than distributing them to shareholders like we see often in the Premier League. And we actually have a situation whereby there's now 38 clubs in England, Wales and Northern Ireland community ownership, and there's 9 in the SPFL under community ownership. I had a little diagram. I obviously haven't included it, but we've got 9 clubs in the SPFL that are kind of run on this system. I'm going to test my memory. Clyde, Greenock Morton, Partick Thistle, Motherwell, Hearts, St Mirren, and an Athletic. And I can't think of the other 2. But these clubs are all run on this basis, essentially. Democratic, non-profit organisations reinvest the funds back in their clubs. They don't go to kind of shareholders, and they're democratic, essentially. So fans own these clubs and run and have a kind of critical say in the way they're run, or owned at least. Okay, references here. I would have shown a little bit of the screening, but actually I think what we'll do is I'll leave you to look at that in your own leisure. This is kind of an interesting look at how football in Scotland has been run and some of the financial difficulties they got themselves into in the kind of noughties. Really recommend watching it. Any questions? Great. Okay, thank you very much. See you soon.